Okay, so I'm going to talk about why security matters and what you can do about it. So I'm going to start with how it's mattered before in the past. So even before computers, security and the lack thereof has changed the course of history. So I interact with the audience here, but since I don't have an audience, who is she? Pregnant pause. You can pause the video and try and think. I'm going to give the punchline. Okay, that is Mary, Queen of Scots, and she is well known for having passed poorly encrypted messages to her sympathizers outside of prison. And so the British figured out what these messages meant and what they decoded to, and they realized that she was plotting, or she was sympathizing with those who were planning to kill the Queen. So she was executed soon thereafter. And that led to the Spanish getting upset and launching the Spanish Armada in 1588. And so what is this? It's a bunch of numbers. This is the Zimmerman telegram. And this was a telegram that the Germans sent through the U.S. to Mexico. And because they were afraid that the U.S. would see this message and decode it, they encrypted it. You see all these code numbers, and these are sort of numbers that go into code books, and then you sort of piece together the message based on the code book. Turns out the British figured out the codes, and so this is what the telegram says. It says, make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So they sent this through the U.S. on the way to Mexico, and this is what it says. So you could imagine this would sort of would upset some people. And of course, so this was sent by the German foreign minister to the German ambassador to Mexico to try and instigate something in Mexico. It was sent in January of 1917. The British, who had early in the war captured the code book, knew what the message read, but they needed a way for the U.S. to decode it. So they ended up sending a captured German code book to the U.S. in February. And within a week, the New York Times headlines sort of indicated that, yes, they were planning on instigating sort of a war between Mexico and the U.S. And so within 1 week of that, or 1 month of that, the U.S., which had been neutral in World War I up until this point, ended 2.5 years of neutrality and entered World War I. So again, broken cryptography leading to some historical event that changed the course of history. Okay, and who are these two people? I don't expect anybody to know. Nobody who has seen this has ever guessed who these two folks are, and I wouldn't have either. These are Stalin's spies. So maybe if you're Russian, because Richard Sorge is a hero in Russia, and that's why he's on the stamp. See, and that's it's a Russian stamp. These guys were in Japan, so Richard Sorge and Hatsumi Ozaki, and they were bouncing all over Japan, transmitting the secret plans of the Japanese in World War II to Russia. And so one of the key pieces of information that got passed was the fact that Japan did not plan on attacking Russia on the Eastern Front, and that allowed Russia in the sort of the fall of 1941 to take all of the troops from the Eastern Front and move it to the Western Front, where they were getting attacked heavily by the Germans. And so that allowed them to turn back the Germans in the fall. So it sort of turned the tide of that war. Okay, so what is this? And actually, people knew this. This is the Enigma. And this is a German device for encrypting and decrypting messages in World War II. It's a multi-stage polyalphabetic substitution cipher, and I give a lecture on how you can figure out how it works in a different talk, but not for this one. This was secretly cracked by the British as well, and it was the subject for the recent movie, The Imitation Game. So they believed that by cracking the Enigma, it led to sort of shortening of the war by about 2 years, and potentially it saved 14 million lives. And more importantly, the guy who was working on cracking the Enigma, Alan Turing, A lot of his ideas on the stored program computer came out of this effort of trying to break the enigma, and that sort of model of computing is what we have all over the country today. I mean, we have cell phones that are based on Turing stored program computer. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about how it matters now, and I would argue that with computers, the importance of security has only increased, not decreased. And it was already significant before. I mean, it's changing world wars. So how is it changing now? So this is Stuxnet, and if you don't know what Stuxnet is, it turns out Stuxnet was malware that the U.S. developed and managed to implant in the nuclear facility Natanz in Iran. And Natanz is the main nuclear enrichment facility in Iran, and that's where, if they were developing a nuclear weapon, that's where it would be done at. And so we implanted this malware that caused a lot of their centrifuges to spin out of control without them knowing about it. It's very clever malware. Malware says everything's good, everything's good, everything's good. Meanwhile, it's sitting there trying to spin the heck out of these centrifuges. And so the ability for us to do that, they estimated set back the nuclear program for the Iranian nuclear program by about 2 years. And so if you follow the news and you see where the nuclear negotiations are with Iran, we would have been in a much weaker position had this not happened. So again, it's a significant change in history due to their lack of security, actually. And so what are these two things? And this really surprised me that someone in the audience actually knew. I'm like, wow, this is the F-35 here, and this is the J-20. So this is the U.S. stealth fighter, and this is the Japanese equivalent. And so it looks like in 2007, the Chinese sort of hacked into Lockheed Martin's networks, and they stole the plans for the F-35. And so early this year, they showed off this J-20, and it looks like some of the design for the F-35 made it into this plane. So again, when you don't have good security, stuff like this can happen, and this is why it's such an important thing to work on. Okay, so who is that guy? And again, somebody most people haven't heard of. And how much money can you get for turning this guy in? Turns out a lot of money, a lot more than I'll see in my lifetime. So this guy is a Russian who is responsible for the malware Game Over Zeus. And it turns out this malware led to the theft of about $100 million from U.S. businesses and consumers. And so you can get $3 million for turning this guy in. And what he had done pales in comparison to what was recently revealed, where another set of, they believe, Russian hackers stole about $1 billion from banks worldwide. Now, the stakes are rising, and as soon as you have attacks against the financial system of the planet, you're talking about some severe consequences, because without trust in the financial system, you get a run on banks, and you've got some serious problems. So, again, we have to fix this, otherwise we're all going to suffer. But since most of you guys are in high school, you're like, I don't have any money. I don't care about banks, and I'm not going to fly fighter planes anytime soon. But here's something a little closer to home. This is something called Firesheep, and what Firesheep used to do was allow you to monitor a network and see credentials of social media accounts going by, and allows you to hijack that identity and post as that person going over a social network. So that's not good. So, and it used something called cookie hijacking, and cookie hijacking was possible because people didn't really care about what the sites were using in terms of security and what the network that they were connecting to was using in terms of security, and that made this attack possible. So, and another thing that allows hackers or adversaries to capture identities is vulnerable web servers. So recently, Russian hackers have figured out about 1 billion internet usernames and passwords. And the reason why this happens is because if someone has an insecure web service and a whole bunch of users use it, a lot of times users are reusing their usernames and passwords, and so they'll upload those same credentials onto this website, and then because that has been compromised, the adversary has gotten all of the accounts of that person because they're typically being reused. So that's a problem. All right, and so finally, it's going to matter in the future. And so the projection is that with the proliferation of the Internet of Things and cyber-physical systems, so Internet of Things is connecting all these things onto the Internet, all the devices, all the little sort of actuators or sensors out there, and cyber-physical systems where we take traditional physical systems like cars and we instrument them with connections to cyberspace. With the proliferation of that, we're about to hand over much more control of the world to software. And we have to make sure that that software actually works and is actually secure against adversaries. And a lot of times, it's not, which is unfortunate. Okay, so the first thing is, what is this? And most people shouldn't know. Well, most people don't know what this is. It's just about now being released. So this is Pavlok. And this is a little wristband that you wear on your wrist, and whenever you do something that you really don't want to do, it gives you a shock. So this is all fine and good, but if you look at how it's secured with Bluetooth, which is like a 4-digit PIN. And so if an adversary were to, say, hijack that Bluetooth, he could send you electric shocks at will. So that sort of sucks, but at least you can take this thing off if he manages to do that. But what about that? So that is actually something that gives you an electric shock as well. But that's a pacemaker. It's supposed to shock your heart into a regular rhythm. Do you care if it's secure? Or is this possible?
You okay? I don't know.
Actually, it's not for my family. It's for me. Because I want to feel clean again. And because I pretty much disagree with everything you say and do.
That's very funny. You got some balls, Brody, I'll give you that.
I'm not joking.
Call doctor.
So yeah, they use a remote attack on a pacemaker to assassinate the vice president of a TV show. So is that, it's TV, that would never happen. Well, as it turns out, there's this hacker, Barnaby Jack. There was this hacker, Barnaby Jack, who watched this episode and was like, hey, you know what? His first thought was that TV is so ridiculous, you don't need a serial number to pull off this attack. So in the episode, they get the serial number of the pacemaker, and then they figure out how to assassinate the vice president based on the serial number they break in. So it turns out you don't need the serial code at all, and you can still do this. And this is from a hacker who managed to, like 2 years earlier, managed to get an ATM machine to spit out all of its money. So immediately you should be sort of like nervous, this guy actually might be able to pull off what he says he does. And sure enough, within a couple months, he had a pacemaker hack. And so pacemakers are programmed with, or one of the functions is sort of a defibrillator function, where if you go into a rest, it'll give you a large shock. So it turns out he was able to figure out how to connect to a pacemaker to remotely get that thing to deliver the defibrillation shock, the 830 volt jolt. And so that's not good. And so as it turns out, the former vice president, Dick Cheney, was actually watching this all unfold. And it turns out he had seen enough, and so he revealed in 2013 that his wireless network sort of component of his pacemaker had been disabled for about a year. And that was about the time when this stuff sort of really broke. So, yeah. All right, so who cares about pacemakers? A lot of you guys are young, got no problems with your heart. Only old people like me that have to think about pacemakers. But a lot of you are about to drive cars, or are driving cars, actually the juniors driving cars. So what about cars? So cars are secure, right? And here's another video.
Morning on the cyber threat to our cars. Leslie Stahl talked to researchers at the Pentagon's DARPA lab for last night's 60 Minutes. She got a first-hand demonstration of the potential for a digital attack on the drivers.
Using a laptop, the hacker dialed the car's emergency communication system and transmitted a series of tones, flooded it with data. As the car's computer tried sorting it out, the hacker inserted an attack that reprogrammed the software, gaining total remote control.
Oh my God. The horns. They're doing that? They're doing the horns. They could control the gas, the acceleration. They could control the braking.
That's right.
And they could do this from anywhere in the world.
So you think that's scary? Yeah, nearly all new cars on the road today are vulnerable to hacking.
Okay, so that showed how someone could wirelessly flood the computers, the network within the car. And so the car is connected with this sort of controller area network that's shared among all the components of the car. And so by flooding one set of components, they could actually inject commands that controlled the car remotely. And so that's bad enough, but the vision of the future is to have these sort of highly connected cars where cars would be able to communicate with each other, be able to communicate with objects outside as they're driving by. And the issue here is that if someone has implanted something, decides to send your car some messages from the environment, you have a car out of control. So, that has to be done securely, and security isn't GM's core competency. So what are you going to do? This can't be avoided if they put this in every car as a value add. Well, how do you know that this thing is going to work? And so one of the senators from Massachusetts, Ed Markey, is really pushing for some strict standards on what goes into cars just because of this. And so he actually talks after that first minute of that previous video, he talks about some of the issues there. So they're trying to push that through Congress. And here's another car that uses a lot of wireless communication to work, the self-driving car. And you can see all the different places it's getting input. And every time you see wireless input going into a car, it's an avenue for potential attack. And so you have to make sure all sort of avenues are secure. And one avenue that people don't think about is GPS. And so if you think about a car, one of the most essential things that a car needs to know is its position, right? To route around wherever it needs to go. Well, as it turns out, GPS can be spoofed if you're using the non-military grade GPS, which most of us are. Moreover, you can jam that signal to completely confuse a car. And so here we are, we're relying on all of this stuff that assumes GPS is just rock solid, and you can easily sort of subvert GPS to not do what it's intended. And there have been cases where, so the top bar is, the top paragraph talks about how they use GPS spoofing to force this $80 million super yacht to go off course towards a direction where it would crash into a rock. That's not good. The other one is GPS jammers, and where Drivers who didn't want to be tracked by their employers would jam the GPS signal so that their truck, the monitoring system on their truck wouldn't know where they were. The problem is when they drove that truck near the Newark airport, it disrupted the systems, the air flight control systems in Newark airport. So that's not good. We have mission critical stuff that's not secure against this. Okay, and here's one that just happened this week, in fact. Airplanes. And so a lot of these airplanes have these in-flight entertainment systems, and you would hope that the in-flight entertainment system that the passengers are using are completely separate from the sort of the runtime controls of the plane itself. Turns out they're not, and that's a big problem because if you look at this picture, it's a picture of the video sensor pointed at the plane, from the rear of the plane to the front, and that's being shown on somebody's display, the back seat, the display on the back of the seat. And so clearly you have some access to the avionics of the plane, because in order for this to happen, they have to all be connected. Something that people have seen before is the in-flight map. Again, you have direct access to get the ground speed, to get the geographic location of your plane. And so if you have Wi-Fi on board and you have a connection that allows you to get access to the avionics of the plane, you could potentially, theoretically, control the plane. And this is something that, the FAA was like, yeah, this could happen. And the GAO, this was in April, mid-April, where they warned that airplanes' computers could be hacked. And it turns out, this is May 20th, about 5 days ago, May 15th, there was a breaking story where a hacker actually managed to get the plane to climb from the in-flight entertainment system. He hacked into the in-flight entertainment system and then got into the avionics of the plane and got the plane to temporarily rise in altitude. So that's not good. So hopefully that should convince you this is a problem that's worth solving, that we should all try and be working on solving. Now I want to talk about what you can do about it. And one of the things I really wanted to focus on was broadening the scope of the people who are working on this problem. Because a lot of times you'll get people who be like, gosh, I'm not good at math, I'm not interested in engineering, technology, I don't really have a natural talent for. And so what I wanted to sort of start with is debunking some myths as to who should be involved and why it's everybody. Why the answer is everybody. So the first, so this was my sort of motivation. So the first is that the arts and humanities have set policy and driven public awareness of internet and cybersecurity throughout history. And so if you are aware of these issues and you can sort of distribute that message widely, then that is an avenue to really help with this problem, and I'll give you some examples of this. The first is this particular movie, which I think someone had pointed out in the talk. This is War Games, and this is a fictional depiction of a nuclear event that almost happened, and it's fictional, by a high school kid hacking into NORAD, which is sort of the system that controls the nuclear arms of the U.S. And so this movie, even though it was fictional, led to such an emotional response from not only the public, but from the lawmakers, that immediately after this, you saw a half dozen computer hacking and fraud acts trying to be pushed through Congress to make the penalties for doing something like this really stringent. You can see on the left, it led to sort of basically felony penalties. So if you hack computers, it's a felony, and that severe penalty is directly because of sort of the emotional sort of fallout of War Games. People felt so threatened by this that they were like, we have to really increase the punishment, because you wouldn't think of computer hacking as something that would deserve a felony for someone. And so that is what's on the books now, so that when somebody who's sort of hacking but is not doing anything so severe, in fact, Aaron Schwartz was one of these guys. He was doing something that, yeah, he was sort of copying, copyrighted material from one place to another. He got charged with, under this act, it was a felony, and he ended up committing suicide because he was under this sort of legal bind. And so this is sort of where the law as it was enacted was, many thought was an overreaction, and that needs to be changed. All right. But more important than just the Computer Fraud Act that the War Games movie sort of led to, more important was its impact on the sitting president at the time, which was Ronald Reagan. And so Ronald Reagan didn't have in his agenda nuclear arms proliferation or sort of reduction in nuclear arms or arms control initially. But his biographers, several of his biographers were sort of going through and understanding how this happened, that by the end of his term, he became, he sort of pushed arms control. And so in 1983, Ronald Reagan, in a short period of time, saw War Games and saw another movie the day after, which depicts a town in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. And that led to such a deep impression that within a year of seeing those movies, he sort of dropped the preconditions for talking to the Soviet Union about sort of things like arms reduction. And so he so badly wanted to reduce the nuclear arms at that point because of watching these movies, they think, that he was like, okay, we have this Cold War where we are not talking to each other. And so that initial sort of motivation allowed him to change how we treated the Soviet Union. And so by 1987, the punchline is that he actually got the first sort of, or a major arms reduction treaty signed with the Soviet Union, the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. All right, so that's just one movie. The other example that I like to refer to is John Oliver and net neutrality. And unfortunately, this probably doesn't play for high schoolers. This is TVMA, so don't watch this video. Guarantee. Yeah, well, it's not my, telling you not to. So net neutrality is the notion that internet service providers are allowed to differentiate between kinds of traffic and either charge the person more or slow down traffic of a certain kind more, or charge a service provider more. And so if you understand how the internet evolved sort of as an open system where everything was treated equally. And architecturally, there's a lot of reasons why this is very powerful. You as an up-and-coming application provider, if you want to deploy a new application, you don't have to worry about having to pay a tax to the service provider in order to get that application to work. So the sort of the differential pricing and the sort of pay-to-play sort of model that net neutrality is sort of preventing. So these bad, potentially if Comcast had its way, or Comcast, or I shouldn't single out just Comcast, if the service providers had their way, you would have to pay into their coffers in order to deploy something. And so net neutrality is a strong position that says that cannot happen. And so the FCC was on the verge of allowing this differential pricing. People had given up on net neutrality ever making it. And then John Oliver, in one of his initials, like within the first month of him starting his show, he did this 13-minute clip on net neutrality that managed to bring down the FCC's website with user sort of comments talking about what an outrage it was that the FCC was allowing this to happen. And sure enough, about a month ago, or 2 months ago now, the FCC passed the first sort of widespread net neutrality rules to preserve it. So this is a 13-minute clip by a comedian / journalist who managed to change policy. So, all right. So finally, which event did this book foretell? This is Tom Clancy's Debt of Honor. So this is the first two were sort of video. This is a book. So if you read the Wikipedia summary of what Debt of Honor is, the plot says, at the end, an embittered Japan Airlines pilot, driven mad by the deaths of his son and brother during a conflict, flies his Boeing 747 directly into the U.S. Capitol during a special joint session of Congress and kills the president and a bunch of lawmakers. And that foretold 9/11. And so that was 7 years before the most significant attack on U.S. soil ever. And so one of the sort of the postmortems about 9/11 was that if you look at what the failures of 9/11 were, one was an intelligence failure, and so one was an intelligence failure, one was sort of an imagination failure. And so on the latter, the problem is that a lot of people aren't thinking outside of the box when it comes to security. So a lot of them they saw an option where maybe someone could use a plane, but they discounted it because that would never happen. And the thing is if those who are really thinking sort of ahead, sort of signaled this out, and Tom Clancy was one of them. And so when they sort of did this sort of analysis, they were like, hey, you know what, we need a concerted effort after 9/11 to bring in all the creative thinkers to talk about potential scenarios that people might use to cause disruption. And so it's really important for non-technical people even to sort of contribute to this. In fact, you don't want to ask a technical, an engineer necessarily all the different scenarios that their sort of technology can be misused, because that's not what they think about. Policymakers, journalists, authors, those are the folks who will be sort of influential in sort of opening our minds to that. Okay, so the key take-home point was that of the 9/11 Commission report is that if we want to prevent a cyber equivalent to 9/11, then we basically need everyone involved. We need everyone to think outside of the box, and we need basically all of the students. And that's sort of why I'm doing outreach into the high schools to at least get people aware of the problem and its importance, so that it guides them as they begin to incorporate more and more technology into their lives. Okay. So where do you go from here? And these are options. For those who are technically oriented, there's a security competitions, capture the flag security competitions, which are often used to not only learn about security, but to sort of practice skills. And so here are some options. HSCTF, High School CTF, is a competition in May, which is going on right now. I don't know, did Sunset field a team? No?
Sorry.
All right, well, I rushed through these slides, so maybe the URL went by before. Pico CTF, which is something that we play here actually, even though it's a high school one. It has a lot of good problems there. That's in October. And then we locally at Portland State host Oregon CTF, which is open to high school, college, and graduate students. And the top high school finisher this year placed 9th overall and got $400. So I encourage anyone who's interested in security to pursue these options. We also run a high school cyber academy camp for rising sophomores in high school. And this is taught, oh wait, no, this is not the one. We have a cyber academy camp taught by Jason on web security, reverse engineering, and cyber awareness. That'll be taught this summer, and there's a URL for that. And they really want people to sign up, so doesn't require, it requires a little bit of, I think we're going to require a little bit of programming. What's the prerequisite? Just
Basic programming.
Basic programming experience. So if you have basic programming experience, you should look into this. The content is pretty compelling. You break into websites, you break into a toy website using things that a lot of adversaries use quite a bit, like the common avenues of attacking websites. You look at embedded code, like code that would run on a phone, and you analyze it and you try and figure out where the vulnerabilities are. And then the cyber awareness part of that, which is a little less technical, but so worthwhile. The thing that I started to describe is the Cyber Discovery Camp, and this is for rising sophomores. And this is 10 high school teams exploring topics in cryptography, robotics, and the liberal arts. And there's a link here. This, Sunset would be able to field a team next year for. We had 9 teams this year. We had room for more. So it requires, typically there's 2 teachers involved. There's one who's a technical teacher and one who's a liberal arts teacher. And then they would pick a team of 6 students, and it's a week-long camp, and they do things like this cryptographic urban race. So if you like urban races, like The Amazing Race or Challenge Nation, you know those. We got one that uses cryptographic challenges and puzzles that you solve. We have a capture the flag for the first part of the camp to get people trained on the skills they would need to do the urban race. But this is for the cryptography part, which I'm actually helping design this year. And so we've got this really cool capture the flag urban race thing based on the Divergent books. So that's a series that lots of high school kids have read. I had to go read it because I was basing a CTF on a young adult novel, and I was like, oh, I guess I better read some. So it was very entertaining, and we've got a lot of content based on Divergent woven in there. So hopefully it's a good time for the students. And then finally, I run internships. I run Saturday Academy's ACE internship. With Saturday Academy's ACE program, I run internships, summer-long apprenticeships in computer security, and that's the link. So, all right, that's all I got.
Do you remember any questions from?
Yeah, I got one. Are there any specific steps or practices that the common person can take to stay secure with their devices?
Yeah, there are many preventative steps for stuff like username and passwords. For your most important things, you need a separate username and password. And so that is one of the big things. Or if you have, if you're logging in with Facebook through other things, make sure that thing is super solid. Like you're not using a dictionary word for a password. For my own personal use, like when I go to a bank site, my user ID is nothing like my user ID for my email or my user ID for my university account. It's got other things in it so that if someone captures my user account on Gmail, they can't just use that username onto my bank site. And then my passwords are different. And then the other thing I do is I use incognito mode a lot. So you bring up basically a vanilla web browser with no credentials in it established, and you log into your sort of critical web server with that, and then you log out and you delete that session when you're done. So these sorts of precautions will protect you against certain attacks that are trying to steal your credentials. So if your credentials are only present in an incognito window for the period of time you're in that critical site, and then you delete that session, then those credentials aren't around for someone to try and attack, and that's happening a lot these days. So yeah, and you basically have to be a harder target than the person next to you. It's sort of one of those things. Is like you don't have to outrun the bear; you just have to outrun the person next to you, sort of things. That's what it's like, because there are so many sort of low-hanging fruits out there that's what the attackers are going after. Like the billion usernames and passwords, hopefully those are all the people that are using dictionary words. I have this top 10 list of common passwords. It's like I love you or hockey or these sorts of things that people are using. And so I use passwords like that for random websites that I don't care about. But for the critical stuff, yeah, that's for sure. You have to be mindful of what you're doing when you do it, so that when you get into the habit of creating a new window and using your credentials only for that window and then shutting that window out, clearing it out, that's probably the best thing for web browsing. For mobile phones, a lot of people are looking at, hey, look, there's a new app of the day, or a new app here or there. You got to be careful. You have to I look at what's really, really been downloaded a lot, like millions of downloads. Then you can be like, okay, well, so that app, at least it has been vetted. You always want to look for things that have been vetted. So if you're just randomly getting stuff from the App Store, that's where you're potentially more vulnerable. So yeah, we don't really have a course that teaches strategies for surfing safely, but that would be a good course to make. Do that one day.
Anything else? I think that was most of it.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, not at all.